John F. Kennedy was our nation's 35th president. As a member of one of the richest and most influential families in America, his was a life of privilege, yet he was continually plagued by illness and injury. Returning home a hero after World War II, Kennedy began a life of public service in Boston, Massachusetts, that eventually led him to the White House in Washington, D.C. His presidency was a time of pride and promise, a time of crisis and conflict, a time of triumph and tragedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in an affluent suburb of Boston, Massachusetts called Brookline. His mother was named Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. Her father, John Honey Fitzgerald, was the mayor of Boston. John Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was also a very successful man, yet he came from humble beginnings. He was born the son of a saloon owner, but worked hard and did well in school. He did so well that he became the first of the Kennedy family to attend Harvard. After he graduated, he went into finance and banking. He proudly proclaimed that he wanted to be a millionaire by the age of 35, and he was well on his way to doing it. The marriage of Rose Fitzgerald and Joseph Kennedy did more than bring two young lovers together in matrimony. It brought two powerful and successful Massachusetts families together. The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys were usually on the opposite ends of political issues and elections. Rose's father was elected 3 times in a row for Congress. Ironically, he was defeated in the 4th-term race by Joseph's father, Patrick Kennedy. But through this union of Rose and Joseph, the two families that had formerly been rivals were now united. John Kennedy was fortunate to be born to such a well-to-do family. Unfortunately, his luck stopped there. He was born with a rare adrenal condition that nearly killed him at birth. He was so ill that on the day he was born, a Catholic ritual called the last rites was performed on him. The only time last rites were said to people was when they were on their deathbed. But John was a fighter and would survive this battle with illness and face many more throughout his life. John had 3 brothers and 5 sisters. John attended a grade school called Dexter, where his older brother Joe went to school. At the age of 13, John began attending a private high school in New Milford, Connecticut called the Canterbury School. He became so ill while he was there that he was forced to withdraw from the school and return home for treatment. This was becoming an all too common occurrence in John's early life. After he recovered, he attended a very prestigious high school called Choate Preparatory School in Wallingford, Connecticut. John loved school and enjoyed learning. His favorite subject was history. He not only graduated from Choate in 1934, but also was voted most likely to succeed despite mediocre grades. John quickly set his sights on college. For a short time, John attended college in London, but was again forced to withdraw due to illness. When he recovered, he wanted to return to school quickly. With a little help from his influential family, he was accepted to Princeton University. John left for Princeton, eager to learn and explore. Unfortunately, he fell ill again while attending school there. He was forced to leave his second university and seek treatment. In 1936, John was fully recovered from his illness and began to attend college at Harvard University, where his father had received his degree. While at Harvard, he faced further battles with health, but persevered through them all. In fact, John actually played on the Harvard freshman football team while weighing only 149 pounds. It was a testament to his will and determination to overcome all obstacles. After John's freshman year at Harvard, his father Joseph was appointed to a prestigious position in the federal government by the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He became the ambassador to England. This meant that he would handle matters of political interest between Great Britain and the United States. While at Harvard, John again fell ill and had to take a break from school. While he recovered in the hospital, he wrote a book that was based on his undergraduate thesis called Why England Slept. This book dealt with the issues surrounding the rebuilding of the German forces between World War I and World War II. It questioned why England was not acting during this period to prevent the further threat of war or to prepare for the imminent arrival of battle. John's prominent family afforded him the luxury of having important publishers look at his book. The editor of Time and Life magazines personally wrote the introduction. It became a bestseller. By 1941, 80,000 copies of the book had been sold, although it was rumored that John's father bought as many as 40,000 of those copies personally. After his illness, John attended Harvard again and graduated with honors. He enrolled in graduate classes in business at Stanford University in California. John loved the sun and the fun of California. He managed to lead a very exciting life there, but the fun wouldn't last forever. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forced America into World War II. John tried to enlist in the United States Army, but was rejected because of back problems. He didn't let that stop him. He tried enlisting in the United States Naval Reserves. After undergoing a 5-month regimen of special exercise, he became a sailor with the rank of ensign. He was appointed to a position in naval intelligence. What he wanted, though, was to go to war. He desired to be on the front lines of battle, not in the boardrooms thousands of miles away. He decided to go into what was called PT school. This was a training school for pilots of small, swift, wooden-hulled boats called PT boats. These were equipped with torpedoes and managed by a small crew. After school, he was appointed commander of a PT boat named PT 109. This appointment would lead to one of the most heroic and memorable events of John's life. In August of 1943, off the coast of the Solomon Islands, Kennedy's boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer and ripped in half. 2 of the 14 crew members were instantly killed. Kennedy and the 12 surviving crew members clung to wreckage from the boat and were finally forced to swim miles in the open ocean to find safety. Kennedy reportedly rescued several sailors by towing them until they were able to find an island. Kennedy dragged one of the men by his life jacket straps, which he held in his teeth. Once on the shore, the soldiers didn't want to light signal fires. They feared that the enemy might see the fires and attack. So Kennedy would swim out into the ocean several miles to attempt contacting ships that were passing by. He also swam between the surrounding islands, searching for signs of life. After 4 days of eating coconuts and anything else they could find, he was able to locate some friendly natives on a nearby atoll called Cross Island. John carved a message into the husk of a coconut shell and gave it to the natives. They agreed to deliver the message for him. Because of this, the crew of PT 109 was soon rescued, and Kennedy became a hero. He received medals for heroism from the United States Navy and Marine Corps. He had the engraved coconut shell encased in glass and kept it for the rest of his life as a reminder of the event. The heroism of this survival story was reenacted 20 years later in a 1963 movie called PT 109. When asked by reporters how he became a hero, Kennedy replied, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." The heroic deeds of his experience were no comfort during the coming years' tragedies. War injuries required him to have back surgery. While he recovered in the hospital, his older brother, Joe Jr., was killed while flying an experimental bomber over Europe. This devastated his family. Joe's death would have a profound effect on John's life. Before his death, Joe, as the oldest son, was expected to go into politics after the war. With Joe's passing, the burden to become a politician fell squarely on John's shoulders. Later, when he was a U.S. Senator, he said, "Just as I went into politics because Joe died, if anything happens to me tomorrow, my brother Bobby would run from my seat in the Senate. And if Bobby died, Teddy would take over for him." In 1946, John Fitzgerald Kennedy ran for Congress in the 11th District of Massachusetts. He was a newcomer to politics, but his family name was enough to finance and win his first campaign. He won his first effort with 42% of the popular vote. The veteran congressmen refer to the newcomers to Congress every year as the freshman class. Kennedy entered the freshman class of 1947. This was the same year as another notable congressman and future rival of Kennedy's named Richard Nixon. Kennedy remained in Congress for 3 terms and developed the tools he needed to someday run the nation. In 1952, John decided to run for the United States Senate against the popular Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge. With the help of his family, especially his brother Robert, who managed the campaign, Kennedy won the election by 70,000 votes. As a United States Senator, Kennedy fought for labor reform and civil rights legislation. In the area of foreign policy, he took a strict anti-communist view. The year after his election, he met his wife, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. Jacqueline, or Jackie, as she came to be known, was an independently successful woman. She was named Debutante of the Year at her high school in 1947. She then attended Vassar College for a short time and transferred to George Washington University, where she eventually graduated in 1951. Jackie was a special woman. One day, she would come to be the envy of every woman in America. She was beautiful, successful, educated, and about to marry the young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The courtship was short. In September 1953, they were married in Newport, Rhode Island. It was a storybook ceremony, lavish and perfect. Over 800 guests attended the ceremony, and countless reporters covered it as a major news event. His life was almost perfect for the moment, but in 1954, he required back surgery yet again. While laid up in recuperation, he wrote another book. This book profiled the views of American political heroes who had fought for just but unpopular causes. These were people like John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster. The book was called Profiles in Courage. As his previous book had, it became a bestseller. In 1957, it won the coveted award for literature called the Pulitzer Prize. That same year, on November 27th, his first daughter, Caroline Bouvier Kennedy, was born. The publication of this book, along with his efforts in Congress and in the Senate, and his heroic deeds in World War II, helped get Kennedy's name out to all America. His newfound fame put him in positions he hadn't imagined. In 1956, he narrated a political film that was shown before the Democratic National Convention. He decided to try and gain the nomination for vice president, but lost to a Tennessee senator named Estes Kefauver. Kennedy was not bothered by the loss. Instead, he was inspired. In 1958, Kennedy was re-elected as a United States Senator by beating his opponent by more than 870,000 votes, the largest margin of victory in the history of Massachusetts politics. With his popularity at home soaring, Kennedy decided it was time to seek a higher office. On January 2, 1960, John F. Kennedy announced his candidacy for President of the United States. This campaign would pit him against his old congressional friend and the current Republican Vice President, Richard Nixon. This would be a campaign that was like no other the world had ever seen. It was the first so-called television campaign. Before that, most Americans didn't have televisions. The recent popularity of television offered a new tool that politicians could use as a pulpit. This would be the first race in history covered completely by the press and brought entirely into the living rooms of almost every American. Kennedy used this new powerful tool in his campaign. His family helped him pay for television spots promoting his bid for the presidency. Before he could officially run for president, he had to win the nomination of the Democratic Party. He would propose his candidacy next to other Democrats who were running. The Democratic Party would then decide who their candidate would be. John was up against the majority leader of the Senate, Lyndon B. Johnson. Kennedy won the nomination and then asked Johnson to become his vice presidential candidate. Once Kennedy was nominated, he began to campaign against the Republican nominee, Nixon, in a blitz that utilized all his power, intellect, and every member of his family. For the first time, televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy were held. These debates allowed the public to see the young, articulate, good-looking Kennedy in a wonderful light. He was a powerful speaker, and the forum of televised debate gave him a chance to win over much of America with his charisma and charm. By the time the 1960 election arrived, Kennedy was at the top of his game. 69 million voters turned out to cast their ballots in one of the closest elections in history. When the votes were counted, Kennedy had received 49.7% of the popular vote. Richard Nixon had received 49.6%. It was a difference of only 113,000 votes, but it meant that John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States and that Lyndon B. Johnson was the new Vice President. Just 16 days after his election, his son, John Jr., was born. Kennedy was inaugurated January 20th, 1961. He gave a rousing speech that touched on civil rights, freedom, and the equality of men.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
He also challenged the nation by saying,
"Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country."
John F. Kennedy's election was a special event in the history of America. He was, after all, the youngest president ever elected, the first Catholic, and the first president who had been born in the 20th century. He was replacing the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was also inheriting all of the problems Eisenhower's administration had developed. The nation was in a frantic state. The civil rights movement was sweeping the country. Americans were crying out for higher wages and better jobs. On the foreign front, there was also trouble. The world was locked into a battle between communism and democracy. There were growing U.S. concerns about a new Soviet ally, an island in the Caribbean called Cuba. There were also worries about growing tensions in the Southeast Asian country called Vietnam. In Germany, a battle raged between democratic West Berlin and communist East Berlin. The world was in turmoil, lost in conflict and struggle. America was the sole beacon of freedom in these times, and Kennedy knew it.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The very first executive order Kennedy signed provided for the formation of the Peace Corps. This was a new program allowing Americans to perform service and give aid to third world nations across the globe, providing basic relief and training for impoverished people no matter where they lived. He appointed his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, as the head of the Peace Corps. He named his brother Robert Attorney General of the United States. Kennedy approved a bill called the Housing Act, which provided federal help to impoverished parts of the country for rebuilding neighborhoods and helping lives. He then helped the working class by signing legislation that raised the national minimum wage. He also signed a bill to create new national seashore parks. One specific incident where Kennedy personally fought for civil rights occurred at the University of Mississippi in September 1962. An African American named James Meredith had attempted to enroll there but was denied the opportunity. When Kennedy heard of the incident, he gave a public television address asking the university to let Mr. Meredith enroll. The speech caused a riot that lasted 15 hours and resulted in the death of 2 people. The National Guard was called in to stop the rioting. After all this, James Meredith was allowed to enroll, and soldiers stayed on campus to assure his safety. In 1963, a similar incident occurred in Alabama when 2 black youths were denied enrollment in a university there. Kennedy again stepped in and won the right of those people to enroll. Kennedy continued to fight for equal rights. A 1963 poll asked African Americans who they felt had done more for civil rights than anyone else in America. The 3rd most popular response was John F. Kennedy, with the NAACP first and Martin Luther King Jr. second. Kennedy's first major foreign policy problem while in office was caused by the tensions in Cuba that Eisenhower had warned him of. In 1959, a revolution had taken place in Cuba. A new communist leader had come into power named Fidel Castro. Castro began to heavily ally himself with the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Cuba was located less than 100 miles south of the tip of Florida. A plan to overthrow Castro was put into effect in April of 1961. This plan, which was developed during the Eisenhower administration, was to land a group of American-trained Cuban exiles on Cuba. These soldiers, theoretically, would silently land at a location called the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, the landing of troops was not silent or undetected. Instead, a waiting Cuban army met them in. The mission was a complete failure. 114 men were killed, 1,189 were captured, and 150 were reported missing. This was an embarrassing defeat for Kennedy and for America. In an unprecedented move, Kennedy went on national television and accepted total responsibility for this failed mission. His approval rating surprisingly went up. The battle between communism and democracy was beginning to favor the communists. To make matters worse, the Soviet Union was winning what was called the space race. They'd managed to put a man into space before America. In response, America's first man in space, Alan Shepard, soon followed on May 5, 1961. Kennedy wanted to ensure that the United States would win the race to be the first to land a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
In June of 1961, Kennedy met with Soviet leader Khrushchev in Vienna, Austria. The two debated over the conflicts that existed in Vietnam and in Berlin between democratic and communist forces. Unfortunately, no compromises were reached at that meeting. In Berlin, the tension between the two forces grew so high that the end result was the building of the Berlin Wall. This wall would separate the city of Berlin into two separate halves, the western half of which would be democratic and the eastern half which would be communist. During the building of the wall, American and Soviet troops stood facing each other on each side of the border. The threat of war loomed over the men. The slightest spark and bullets could begin flying. In August of 1961, the Berlin Wall was finally completed and would remain intact for the next 28 years. America and democracy were given a great boost in February of 1962 when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in a Mercury capsule named Friendship 7. But this joy would not last forever. In October of 1962, the world came as close as it ever had to nuclear war. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy delivered a public address that revealed the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency had taken secret spy photos that showed Soviet nuclear missiles in place on the island of Cuba. Kennedy took immediate action and issued a warning to Soviet leader Khrushchev to remove the missiles. The United States began stopping Soviet ships that held more missiles from getting to Cuba. This was called a naval blockade. On October 24th, over a dozen Soviet ships were halted or turned back. Khrushchev wanted to negotiate the removal of his missiles from Cuba in exchange for the removal of United States weapons from the Eastern European country of Turkey, but Kennedy refused to compromise. Khrushchev soon backed down and ordered that the missiles in Cuba be moved out, and by 1964, Nikita Khrushchev had fallen from power in the Soviet Union. Kennedy had resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully without a single shot being fired. It was his shining moment as president. But the communist threat was worldwide. President Kennedy felt that the Southeast Asian country of Vietnam needed much attention. Kennedy felt that Vietnam was a cornerstone of democracy. He felt that if Vietnam fell to communism, the entire continent of Asia might follow. In an effort to reinforce the South Vietnamese, a steady stream of U.S. soldiers were sent over to the troubled country. By 1963, there were over 16,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. This conflict would not be resolved during Kennedy's administration. During his third year in office, he proposed sweeping civil rights legislation, signed a nuclear test ban treaty, saw the final Mercury astronaut launched into space, and spoke to the people of Berlin on the virtues of freedom and democracy. Then, in an effort to boost his popularity in the southern U.S. before the next presidential election, he traveled to Texas. On November 22, 1963, one of the greatest tragedies to afflict our nation occurred in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy rode in a motorcade with the governor of Texas and their wives. They waved at the crowd and graciously accepted cheers and applause from their convertible. Suddenly, the jubilant atmosphere was shattered. The sound of gunshots exploded from out of nowhere, and the shriek of screaming bullets raced through the crisp November sky towards the convertible. In a flash, the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was dead, killed by a lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald from a book depository in downtown Dallas. The nation was stunned. A huge funeral procession wound its way through the nation's capital that weekend. Americans clamored to catch a last glimpse of their president. Tears welled in the eyes of an entire nation. As his casket passed through the streets, Kennedy's 3-year-old son, John Jr., saluted his fallen father. Although he had passed away, his memory would never be forgotten. On top of his grave was placed an eternal flame, a fire that would burn brightly forever, much the same as the legacy of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. On July 20th, 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. The goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely before the decade was out had become a reality. President John F. Kennedy had inspired a nation to reach for the stars. His words and deeds inspire us still.